I'm Jamie S. Rich, and this is Back to the Gutter.
I like to use these Pentel pocket brushes.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. I use a Winsor Newton Series 7. I love comics, so I was
This year we're going to bring you another eclectic mix of creative people from all across the comic book industry. We're going to look at the trenches of self-publishing and work our way up to the top of corporate comic books. We're going to have people from all aspects of the field: writers, artists, rising stars, industry veterans, colorists, editors, and hopefully a few people that will maybe surprise you a little bit. Today, we're going to start off in Portland, Oregon, a comic book mecca and my hometown, and we're here to talk to Benjamin Dewey, creator of the Tragedy series and one of the industry's most unique creative talents today. Hey there, Ben. How's it going today?
Good, Jamie. How you doing?
Not too bad. Ready to go back and talk about some comics?
Indeed. Let's do it.
All right. So if you don't know about Periscope Studios, it's where Benjamin Dewey spends about half of his time. He also works at his home studio, which we'll be visiting later. It's here that Ben works on books like I Was the Cat and Tooth and Claw, his series with Kurt Busiek at Image Comics.
So, I guess I've been working on...
So here we are. We're in Periscope Studios in downtown Portland, talking with Benjamin Dewey. How's it going, sir?
It's going very well, thanks.
So I know you from here only. I met you out here, but are you originally from the Chicago area or thereabouts?
I lived in Cleveland for the first 25 years of my life, and it's an awesome place to be from. You know, I think depending on what point you're at in your life, it's probably an awesome place to live. But there was definitely a ceiling on what I was going to be able to achieve, in part because I think that comics and your ability to flourish in that context come down to whether or not you have a community.
Right.
And that has certainly been the case since I came out to Portland, is that once I found Periscope, it made a big difference, but I didn't even know to look to start trying to find it, but I knew on some level that if I was going to do comics or I was going to do music, which were, equally possible trajectories, that I had to be in a place where they were happening,
right,
more so than they were happening in my hometown.
So did you gravitate to one or the other earlier, music or comics, or you were always just creative?
Yeah, I think, I definitely wanted to be a Stevie Ray Vaughan style guitar slinger when I was a teenager. I had, a couple epiphany-like moments. The first time I heard Slash play on Estranged, the first time I heard Stevie Ray Vaughan play Texas Flood in 1983 at the or maybe 81 at the El Macambo. Some footage of him in a Canadian club where he's just melting everyone's face off, and it was just astonishingly great. And so when I first moved out, I was opening for national acts, and I was very dedicated to playing blues-based stuff, and I was playing slide. And essentially I was...
Were you a solo artist?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I was playing fingerstyle, pre-war blues-based stuff, and I was playing in a country western band where I was playing slide guitar and I was playing lead, which was way different than what I'd intended on doing, but my friend Emily Herring is a great songwriter. She's from Texas. She wanted somebody who could do old Hank Williams style lead fills, on console steel, which is another thing I play, and then Brad Paisley-esque leads.
Wow.
And so I was trying to do that, and then she moved back to Texas, and at that point I had gotten so far off doing my own thing, and I'd become disenchanted with performing pre-war blues stuff or even writing my own songs. And I started noticing the way that people play music. They have to hustle all the time in the same way that comic artists have to hustle for
more jobs.
Yeah, for jobs. But then, you hustle for a gig as a musician. You play a club for 20 people, 10 of whom are watching soccer on the Jumbotron behind you, and you make zero money, as opposed to maybe you make, $1,000 or something for drawing 10 pages.
Right.
So it became a lot easier, I think, in part because of the fact that almost everybody I knew who was a musician was hustling, and they'd invite you to come play a show, but sometimes that show would be a half an hour, 45-minute drive away, and what you get promised would be dinner.
Yeah, and you've already paid for gas.
Yeah, exactly. So, and you're hauling your gear out there, and, it depends on who's at the show, but there never seemed to be the right momentum for any of the things I was working on. And so it made it a lot easier once comics started taking off to go with this thing I obviously cared about as I got less enchanted with playing music and more interested in what comics had to offer.
Were you in a creative household growing up, or
Yeah.
were your parents artists as well? Or?
I grew up in this museum. I think it's one of the best museums in the country, and it's free. It's huge, and it had secret passages
Oh my God.
in it. So my dad went from being the guy who worked for Extensions Division and organizing these display cases and essentially making little historical dioramas, which on some level is kind of what I do
Yeah.
with my drawings. And then he became the what do you call it, a public programming director. And so his job, and then eventually my job too, was to create projects that could be done by anybody of any age, of any background, who were going to come into the museum on Saturday and Sunday, and we would have to theme these projects around whatever the great exhibition was. So if there was, Ramses III is going to have this big exhibition with these giant, colossal Egyptian sculptures of stone heads coming in, what can we do that a 5-year-old and their grandparent can do and not get bored? How can you engage and make these little projects? And so that was a lot of my early training was, I'd ride these freight elevators with big, huge crates, or even in some cases, like there it is. There's this, a stone sarcophagus, and I get to ride with the guards going up to install this thing.
Wow.
It's crazy. It's like a Beverly Cleary book or something.
Yeah.
I'm like going behind the scenes in the museum, and I know all the secret things, and people
Solving
are turning
crimes
keys. Yeah, it was awesome. Thinking back on it, was really great.
So what was the inciting incident for comics then for you?
I think when you're young and you show aptitude for something, if you're in the right space and you're encouraged to do it, then you form neural pathways that continually reinforce that. And so I was drawing the things I was seeing from the age of 2 on. I would draw Bumblebee from the Transformers, and I would get praise for it. I don't remember the context exactly, but I remember my parents being pleased. And you like whatever your thing is, you end up
Right.
kind of chasing that feeling there ever after. And then when I saw Jim Lee's big fold-out X-Men cover for the I guess it's like the reboot of X-Men, whatever year that was, 1992, 1991.
Something like that, yeah.
That had the same effect, that I hadn't seen comics in a long time. Or the ones I did were kind of musty, and they had the comics code thing. And
Right.
I liked all that stuff, but the drawing seemed old-fashioned. Which now, of course, I love a lot. But at the time when I saw Jim Lee, I was like, whoa, that's like a bit of outer space had been brought down and just splashed with all the colors of my childhood across this fold-out piece of artwork that had Magneto and Colossus and Beast and everybody, and they had purpose in their eyes. And from that point on, I was like, yeah, comics. That's where you do it. You make it happen in comics.
I Was the Cats coming out from Oni.
Mm-hmm.
It will be out by the time people see this, but that's with Paul
Yeah.
Tobin.
Yeah.
Was that your first major length work where you worked with another creator?
Yeah. I mean, it was the first thing I did that was longer than 80 pages. I did an 80-page comic that I hope nobody will ever find with friends of mine when I was in high school, called Young Santa.
Well, now we know what to look for.
Yeah, well, it'd be hard because I think there were only 100 copies ever made. And
Jumping on eBay tonight.
yeah. So yeah, when I Was the Cat came along, I had just gotten off of doing a project for, I was drawing a property that I really had attachment to for a long time, and I had such an unsatisfactory experience with it that when Paul Tobin said, "Hey, I got this project. You want to do the penciling, inking, coloring, and lettering?" Because I was doing lettering at the time, I'd agreed to that. I was like, "Yeah, I want to do all of it," not understanding that this is a multi-year commitment.
Right.
Where you will get so tired that you'll learn to see through time and space, and what's at the other end of the tunnel is not always great. So like it was just, there were definitely times where it was agonizing, and I don't recommend trying to do all of the stuff all at once. So and I was excited to do the project, and I'd worked with Paul before, and he writes very challenging, intriguing scripts. But it was certainly more than I could balance, given the type of position I was in at trying to advance my career. And
Right.
I'm glad that we saw it through to completion, but it was a really rough road to make it happen. And I learned a lot.
How long were you on the project?
On and off for 3 years.
Wow, okay.
So, I mean, I started doing it, and right around the time I started doing it, it was kind of, it was not clear how it was going to be published.
Right.
Like there weren't necessarily direct expectations of when it was supposed to come, like how I was supposed to turn in pages, to who I was supposed to be accountable, and so that opened the window to doing tragedy series, because I was like, well, I'm waiting on official word. I'm going to do this thing, and so I at that point started juggling this and that, and I had to pay my rent at the same time. So jobs would come in. Steve Lieber would say, "Do you want to do X job where you draw a bunch of soccer players eating nachos?" Yeah, I'll do it. That's 2 months worth of rent. I'll do it. And so, unfortunately, I was the cat kind of got, shuffled to the bottom of the stack every time, because priorities were coming up that required me
Right.
providing for me and my soon-to-be wife, and trying to pay for our wedding and all these things. So it was a kind of a perfect storm of not great timing. And it took Steve Lieber coming back in and saying, well, I can help you, finance an assistant, and Paul Tobin saying, yeah, man, we got to just, it's not that far to the finish line. I know it seems like a lot because you're on, mile 20 of
Right.
a marathon, but trust me, you're going to get across that finish line. It's going to feel great. And once he said that, it kind of clicked in my head. And, like it was a crazy project. So like I was putting off my wedding and putting off
Right.
my honeymoon so I could do it. And
Awesome. So we're going to look at some of the art
yeah,
and talk about how you put it all together.
awesome.
So do you do a fairly then traditional approach, like you pencil?
Yeah, my process would be roughly like this. So like, let's say I want to draw, I occasionally, like for convention sketches, I'll do this character, Gentleman's Skull, which I after, looking back on one of my favorite comics ever, the Mike Mignola, Amazing Screw-On Head, he's up against this character who has, it's almost irresistible. It's like if Mike Mignola didn't come up with it, somebody else would have. This idea of like a skull with a bow tie and a top hat, and Emperor Zombie, I think he's called, in that. But
I feel like he needs a monocle.
he does, just make him a little bit fancier. And it's like at one point, so I use a pencil, I'll rough things out. And typically what I'll do is I use a certain gauge, or I don't know, gauge is the right word, but thickness of pen. And early on when I was doing it, I wanted to try and duplicate the effortless, fun, in some cases like dead line weight that I would notice cartoonists that I really like would use. And because my tendency is to be picky and to sometimes get into too much information, I wanted to use a deadline weight. So
What do you mean
used,
by deadline weight?
that I don't switch it up typically, like when I'm outlining a form, or I'm transitioning from one brush stroke to another. It keeps a nice containing line, and then you don't get you can't get persnickety with it, simply because it's a thick, utilitarian shape, and the line itself then informs, it keeps me from getting too precious with things. So like, let's say, this might be the level of information I would put down with my number 8 micron. And then I like to use these Pentel pocket brushes. I used to try and use a lot of, beautiful Winsor Newton Series 2, these wonderful brushes. When they're great, they're great. But they kind of require you to have a setup that's not super roadworthy. So like you take those brushes out on the road, you have to baby them, and I'll use another guitar analogy. It's like, if you really, really love your vintage Les Paul, you don't take it out, and you sort of start to learn to make do, and then you even learn to appreciate certain aspects of having the cheaper guitar, in this case a cheaper pen, because like I've beat these things up for 3 years, and I stagger them as I go along so that their lifespan is longer, because I tend to be kind of hard on stuff. But once you've got like you have this thing out there, it gives you 90% of the line you want. That's great. Because Winsor Newton, it may give you a beautiful line, but you really, like when I look at the way that, you know, Joelle Jones will draw, she is, I don't know, she's like a dragon tamer or something. She can get these brushes to, you know, behave in this really elegant way, and I can't always do that, even under the best of circumstances. So I get my goofy little brush pen, I fill it with Ultra Draw, which is this ink. It's good, it's waterproof, it gives me a reliable black every time. And then I also put a couple of drips of that into these water brush pens. And so then I like, if I know where my light source is coming from, then I use these to help fill in what will become the midtones in my process. And in some cases, I will really hate a drawing until I get to the point where I get to do my midtones. And then everything comes alive in this way that it makes it almost feel like I didn't draw that. Somebody better than me drew that. And it's really satisfying, because then, you know, like if I can remove myself sufficiently to have some pride in it, it makes me feel a lot better. And so like the final piece of what I'll do, typically, like, you know, if I let's say I really like this, but I want to do, you know, some enclosing information. One thing I like to do, like if I'm sending out a booklet to somebody, or I'm putting a sketch into someone's hands who I've had a really great conversation with at a convention, is I'll draw a little thing and then send them off with a drawing like this, because I have it in my head pretty well. I can also draw an elephant seal off the top of my head pretty well, because they're my favorite animal. But what I love about this is that, like, you get these Signo Uniball. I found out about these from Terry Nelson, and what's great is, like, you can add little details after the fact, or like a field of stars, or like if he has something to say, you know, like in the form of these little lightning bolts. And so I'll use that kind of thing, like, you know, if like I want a containing line or something like that, where I'll go in and I'll add little bits. And then this was kind of the final piece of my stylistic puzzle. And it also lets me then, like, you know, sign my signature on black.
Oh, nice.
Which I really like. And it's a nice ink because of the fact that it's not totally water resistant, but it's pretty good. And I can go over it with a wash. And so in some cases, even if I've gone in and I've done a correction, I've added some crack to a skull or something like that, and I want to add a little bit more, it will stay. At least that has been my experience, and it's a pretty versatile tool. It adds a lot to my drawings, I think. And I'm down to my last one. These are all gassed out. These last three.
So do you keep the same basic process then, working on like I Was a Cat and Tooth and Claw, doing the larger pages? Yeah, so like the Tooth and Claw stuff, you can see how like you translate that up a little bit more. So like this is, you know, a drawing that, I don't know, it took me 5 minutes, but if I'm getting into a lot of detailed information, I tend not to switch it out to any more than just one uniform gray. But in some rare cases, like if I'm trying to describe the majesty of the Milky Way, I'll fade it a little bit more. I'll use 2 different brushes. And the nice thing is that, like, let's say you want to layer up, you know, just a little bit. And, you know, like Adam Hughes at one point gave me this lesson where he's like, you know, you got to just pick where your light source is coming from and remember it. And so I had never gotten, you know, so much of somebody drawing just like a sphere. He gave me this great little lesson at Comic-Con 2006. But the nice thing is that, like, this process with the alternating my gray brushes, if you take a little time to go back in and you keep putting it down, it's just like watercolor, where you then build successive layers. And if you want to be really delicate with it, another thing that I might do is get a small dish, like a yogurt container, put a tiny bit of Ultra Draw in there with a lot of water, and then I can really smooth things out in the event that I need to get, you know, hyper detailed on things like that page you've got there's pretty insane level of detail.
Or like this, like where you want, like it has to have like slightly smoother gradations.
Right.
Like that's when I use a I don't like to do that because I think, you know, if you want to avoid being excessively precious, and it can be dangerous to introduce too many factors. You know, like I used to say this when I was a guitar teacher about gear, because the kids would come to me and they'd be really excited about, oh, I want this guitar, I want this effects pedal. It's like, you know, no matter what you get, it's just you're still going to be the same player you always were. So if you can't do it with a Pentel pocket brush, don't assume a Winsor Newton's going to save you. In the hands of the right person, it's going to be awesome. But you should find that balance between what's practical and you know, what provides you with the ultimate expression of you know, this thing that's in your head that you want to put down on paper.
No, I think actually on that sage advice, that's a good place to move on to the next thing, which I think
cool.
we're going to go back to your place and listen to some music. So,
okay. Nice.
Thanks for showing us your art process. So that's amazing.
And thanks, man. Yeah, and thanks for talking with me and taking the time. Cool. So like usually when I'm home and I have a few minutes or something like that, I'll play a little bit of something where I'll mostly just jam because I don't have time enough to rehearse anything. It's always some you know, some set of trade-offs, and I'm sure that that's the case with a lot of working pros, is that especially in the years building up to trying advancing my career and taking on projects I care about, something's got to give. And you know, it's like I don't play video games, I don't lay on my guitars, I don't get to play, you know. I feel like sense of working with other people and playing in bands, it gives you a little bit of an insight into sharing a studio space with a lot of people, or collaborating with, you know, people you've never collaborated with before, or the sense of whether or not you and another person might work well for a long-term collaboration. I can apply experiences I had playing in bands with people, and who did I get along with, who didn't I get along with, is their temperament similar? And so then I have this frame of reference from a different discipline, but where similar instincts are required, you know, trusting one another and giving each other space and all that stuff. Right. So.